What does the social model of disability have to do with zero-sum thinking? What are both of those things? You probably heard of the second one, maybe not the first. The social model of disability, or also sometimes called the mere difference model of disability, I first heard about in bioethics school when we were talking about in vitro fertilization and the kinds of decisions that you can make when you're selecting the child that you're going to, the embryo that you're going to implant that will become a child. If you're not familiar, in vitro fertilization or IVF, the process involves the creation of more than one embryo. I don't need to get into the details here, but what happens when you have 7 different viable embryos and you have to pick which embryo you're going to implant and try to have a child with? Should you be ethically allowed to pick the gender? That could be bad. In China, for instance, when there was a one-child policy, there were more abortions of women because there was sexism in society. So is it ethical to choose a gender for your child? Well, you have to choose a gender. You have to pick something. Some people have different sets of rules. You can roll the dice. There's literally a whole literature on this, and I'm not attempting to solve it here. But the reason I bring it up is because there was a case where a deaf couple was trying to use in vitro fertilization, and the ethical question that came up was, could they look for a deaf sperm donor in order to increase the odds of the child being deaf and thus fitting in with the family with 2 deaf parents and I believe another deaf child? Whoa, like weird, because if a child popped out of the womb and you like destroyed their hearing, that would be unconscionable and we would never allow that. But there's this weird question of, okay, well, if I'm just picking an embryo, maybe it's a different story. Can you artificially genetically select for a deaf embryo? And at first glance, it might seem like the answer is obvious, but run the counterfactual, run the other scenario. What would happen if you had a hearing child to 2 deaf parents and a deaf sibling? Like, that life would be different. And it starts to get grainier and grainier, grayer and grayer. And the way that you can start to answer that question is to ask the question of the social model of disability, also known as the mere difference model of disability, from Elizabeth Barnes, The Minority Body. But we're not in bioethics school. We're on the internet, where you need to talk about trendy topics in order to, eat. So I found the social model of disability on page 365 of Jessica McCabe's book, How to ADHD. ADHD might be a mere difference, not a disability. One of the books where you can read about the mere difference is this one of the 7 books that I read about ADHD. This one is called A Hunter in a Farmer's World, and it's about how ADHD genetically might just be better for hunting than for agrarian society, and that's part of why it has stuck around for so long. I'm pretty suspicious of people who do armchair evolutionary biology and say, well, it makes sense that you need laser focus and to be able to pay attention to every little sound in the context of a hunter. It needs sense that you need to make impulse decisions. Like, you can a priori make lots of evolutionary biology arguments. I don't find those super credible, but the reason that I bring it up is because there are advantages to having a super brain that moves really, really fast and has no brakes. It's just not very advantageous when you have to plant corn or sit at a desk for 8 hours a day, or any of the number of things that we have to do as modern people in society. People with ADHD often are calm in crisis situations because we crave stimulation and novelty and we read about it in all of these books. That can be an advantageous thing. That need for stimulation is not necessarily a bad thing so much as a merely different thing. So the question becomes, could we redo the experiment where we were talking about doing genetic selectation, pre-implantation genetic screening for in vitro fertilization with ADHD? Could you select an embryo that is more genetically likely to have ADHD? Would that be disabling your kid, or would that be picking something that is a mere difference model, for your kid? I'm not here to tell you what to think. I did get a master's degree in bioethics, but doing that just convinced me more and more that I don't know nearly as much as I thought that I did. It can be useful to zoom out in this context and ask the question of why this is such a difficult question, and that's in part because of history. Because in this country, we have had a long and unfortunate and unfortunately, it's a terrible word. We've had a terrible history of eugenics and genetic. I'm sorry, I didn't breathe and explain this. In fact, I've covered this in many other videos. Why Fish Don't Exist by Lulu Miller is one book about the history of eugenics. A lot of the Nazi ideas first came from the United States. People like Agassiz and strychnine guy, I can't remember his name. Dorothy Roberts goes into it as well. Harriet Washington, Resmaa, Menakem, and there's literally, I could just keep pulling books and books and books and books and books. The history of discrimination and genetic violence and forced sterilizations in this country is a black spot that we have yet to morally grapple with, because it's so awful we don't even want to look at it. Lulu Miller's book, part of why I recommend it so frequently, is because it's very thin, but it explains in great detail the moral strength. It explains in an accessible way that's sort of narrative and story-tastic, and emotional, and there's a murder mystery, how the history of eugenics is much more gruesome than we really do want to admit. So ethicists in the medical profession are specifically worried about any procedural way that in vitro fertilization could be used as a genetic selection tool, a genetic manipulation of society tool, because our history of that is dark and it bears careful consideration. But let's transition to part 2 and let's start thinking about zero-sum thinking. A visual that you can use to wrap your head around this concept is, in a world where there's lots of ramps and everything is wheelchair accessible, everyone can get everywhere. But in a world where there's stairs and certain places where there are no ramps, only certain people have access to certain things. The world is designed for certain types of bodies, and it excludes others. If the world were designed differently, maybe things that we perceive as disabilities would just be mere differences. Part 2. But wait, a word from our sponsor. It's me. I'm the sponsor. Well, I mean, kind of. Patreon is really the sponsor. They're the most They're the most helpful and stabilizing force in my content creation. I thank you. All the patrons literally make this possible. I need to thank them constantly, and I want to do that. So thank you to the patrons that are making this possible. My goal is a teacher's salary in Patreon. That's my goal. That's all. Okay, back to the video. Zero-sum thinking is pie thinking. There's 8 slices of pizza. If I eat the pizza, then you don't get the pizza. There's only a finite amount of resources to go around, and so I better get mine. Zero-sum thinking is at the root of a lot of neoliberal capitalist policies. But what we can ask the question of is... nope, sorry. I'm pulling too many books. Let's focus on these 3. The Sum of Us is so good. I could make a whole video about it. In fact, we made an entire video series about it called The Community Book Report, back when that was a thing. Many creator friends and I came together to put this together. I will link that in the YouTube description below. The book is full of examples of how doing so, that have the pie model of I take some and then you must lose some, is just incorrect as a way to run society. Chapter 8, for instance, is the same sky. I live in St. Louis, and East St. Louis is right across the river. You can't pollute East St. Louis, which is historically a black neighborhood where we have put factories and chemicals and lots of things. You can't pollute the air over there and not have it come over the river into here. We live under the same sky. So investing in environmental policies that protect the most exploited in society literally helps everyone. But that's just one example. There's other examples with public pools. We're all familiar with the famous images of people throwing chemicals at black people who were swimming in the pools, and angry white people yelling at when pools were getting integrated. As a result of that uproar, many public pools were closed. But guess what? Now there are less public pools. There's more private pools in people's backyards because we got rid of the public pools. And no one can go to them now. Black kids can't go, white kids can't go. It's not the same thing, right? I've talked about it in the other video. But it's not the same thing that, I can't get to go to a pool and so I'm oppressed. No, it's not. A white student or a white kid who can't go to a pool is not in the same category. But keeping the public pool open literally helps everyone. There's more examples of this. The 2008 financial crisis, for instance, may have been avoided if it's called the Ignoring the Canary. There's a chapter where it's we could have avoided the 2008 crisis because bankers tested out a version of those risky exploitative loans on the black population, and people tried to raise the alarm, but just nobody cared because it was only happening to black people. This book is really good. And if we had rejected zero-sum thinking, rejected the pie mentality, and said, well, if I help you, I must be hurting me, we would have a better world than the one that we do right now. Okay, are you starting to see the model of the connection between the social model of disability and zero-sum thinking? People with ADHD need help with timers and reminders and scheduling and calendaring, and there's lots of accommodations that are useful to us. But they're also useful to other people. Providing the accommodations doesn't make the world worse, it makes it better for everyone. Is this starting to make sense? It feels kind of clear cut. It feels like it just should be this way and we should understand it. But when Republicans get involved, when politics get involved, now we start asking the question of who deserves what. Have you earned healthcare? Have you earned housing? If someone is unhoused, they haven't earned the right to be alive, I guess. I mean, we get into these moral questions and we start asking questions of deserving. And those questions are really hard to answer. I would venture they're just as hard to answer as many of these ethical gray area questions about in vitro fertilization. It's a gray area of how much resources you should give to a person. Like if somebody's dying and they need a liver transplant, like there's a finite number of livers. Sometimes there are finite resources that we need to divvy up finitely. But often when it comes to public policy and public assistance, there could be things that we just invest in everyone and it would make it better for everyone, and education is absolutely one of those things. Okay, I just went on tangents citing more and more books about the school to prison pipeline and other examples. I need to just wrap up this video, but I want to focus specifically on the question of education and Project 2025. Project 2025, you've probably heard of it, but if you haven't, it's the Republican plan to just destroy the federal government, more or less. They wanted to get rid of the Department of Education, just gone. They put it in writing, put it down on paper. Oh my goodness. Part of why this is a terrible idea is rich people would be fine. Private schools would be fine. People with money would not feel this initially. Because the cascading effect would be catastrophic to the country. And if you want to think about that in detail, ask the question of, is it cheaper to educate people and have them become productive members of society? Or is it cheaper to pay their rent for them and give them food and pay guards to protect them, keep them from getting out, and pay people to build prisons? And it's cheaper to educate people than it is to imprison them. Why is this hard? It's hard because we ask the question of who we think deserves to be alive. That fundamentally is the question of eugenics. Who deserves to be alive and who does not? And I can't not mention Bryan Stevenson. Bryan Stevenson is my favorite source when it comes to thinking about the horrible realities of mass incarceration, a problem which we just don't have to see. Sorry for the chair again. A problem which we just don't have to see because it's literally behind bars. We can't hear the testimony of people who are prevented from speaking. Bryan Stevenson goes into detail of all the ways that the system is wrong. And part of why I bring him up in particular in the context of this discussion about eugenics is because his speeches online are the place where I learned that we cannot move forward. We will not answer this question unless we can first it was almost a quote, live through an era of truth-telling and reconciliation. We can't fix the problem unless we're willing to grapple with the root of it, which is that we as a country have been asking this horrible question of who we think deserves to be alive ever since the start. This is what the 1619 Project is about. We started with a genocide of indigenous people. In order to get the land, we funded the expansion of our empire and stealing more land like Hawaii and Puerto Rico with the Middle Passage, with slavery. And we never grappled with those tragic realities. And as a result, we have transitioned into a world of mass incarceration and exploitation and medical exploitation. We have to grapple with the truth of the problem. And the rhetoric around the wall and the fear of other people and the neo-fascist impulse of the right-wing party that is arising in the United States and also rising in lots of other countries is the darkest element of humanity rearing its head again. And we don't get around it by ignoring it. We literally have to face it. We have to face it. I kind of broke my visual, but I was intending to do 3 parts to the video. And because good things come in threes, let's wrap up with Fatal Invention and the creation of race itself, the social construction of race. The social construction of race, I've covered this in other places, but it bears repeating. The social construction of race sounds crazy because we think of biology as real. And indeed, again, right-wing rhetoric around biology with regard to gender is biological realism. Okay, the biology says this, and therefore that's what reality is. So taking those same intuitions that I don't agree with, but like say taking those same intuitions, ignoring the social influence of society on gender, you can do an analogy and think, okay, well, DNA makes the skin darker. DNA is biology. Biology determines race. QED, the end. Quod erat demonstrandum. It's fancy for, I said it, I argued it, I did it, as it was demonstrated. Anyway, incidentally, conservatives that are afraid of queer people say the same thing about sexual identity and orientation, sexual orientation and attraction. If you're attracted to men, that goes against the biology. If you're a man attracted to men, that goes against the biology. What are you doing? Biology is destiny. Again, the problem with the history of eugenics is that we often use phrenology and other examples of how we use biology as a justification for creating a world that discriminates. And in the process, we create the discriminatory world. Dorothy Roberts introduced me to this concept. Actually, that's not right. Ruha Benjamin introduced me to the concept of the social construction of race in this book, Race After Technology. And I was like, that's not right. I don't believe that. And I put the book down halfway through. And I was like, biology's destiny. I'm a bioethicist. I studied physics. I know about science. And I was like, genes and alleles and shit. And so I stopped reading it. And then I later was reading Dorothy Roberts' book, Fatal Invention, and she finally argued it. So I'm going to give you the argument in brief here. And I think I did an hour-long focus specific on this on the Too Much Nuance podcast, a podcast I started and never finished. ADHD, baby. I've been editing this for a long time, and I didn't say part 3. Part 3. 9/11. After 9/11, there was a uptick in anti-Arab sentiment. People were afraid of Muslims, and so people who even resembled Muslims were more stressed. The stress showed up in the body, and you could tell because pregnant women had smaller babies. Babies were being born with lower birth weights if they were stressed. And we know it wasn't a genetic factor because Arab women of similar genetic backgrounds in other countries didn't see this dip. It wasn't just like all of a sudden Arab women started having lighter babies. It was the women who were in the United States who were experiencing racial trauma and racial resentment in their everyday lives and fear for their lives. Those people had the lighter children. And there was, even within the United States, a natural experiment that was done. I'm not going to find the page because I've already been filming for too long. It wasn't that hard to find. That was page 129. I highlighted it in red. Or I wrote it in red and highlighted it. Food stamp program. This is an aside, but the food stamp program helped. Public assistance helps. There's lots of data for it. Page 129, we start talking about how I'm having trouble because I love this book and I got distracted. For instance, on page 73, we put it in red. The racial categories that we make up, like I don't know if you've applied for a job recently and they say like, are you white or are you black or are you Hispanic or are you non-Hispanic? Like those racial categories, and then even more sophisticated racial categories that people are using in genetic studies, they don't even work. The geneticists that are studying them often themselves, this is why it was sort of funny, often don't even fit themselves into the categories that they're researching and publishing on. Okay, well, my like Kamala Harris, which box does she go in? Wow, no, we can't figure it out. Because the categories are made up, they're socially constructed. Blackness and whiteness are things that are created, not biological realities. Another example of that, I wrote it down, is the sort of two churches theorem. The differences between individuals individual people within a race genetically are more statistically significant than the aggregate average differences between two races. A white person is more genetically distinct from a random other white people than all white people are distinct from black people. The two churches theorem is imagine a black church, imagine a white church. We can just go, it's on page 52. Imagine a white church, imagine a black church. If you walk into the black church, there's more genetic diversity in there, intra-racial, than between the entire white population and the entire black population. Genetics is not destiny. Race is socially constructed. Let's get back to the birth weight example. There was a natural experiment that was done because there are women who have Arab women who didn't have Arab sounding names. Their names were just whiter. And when they had whiter names, they experienced less stress and their children weighed more. They had more, I didn't say it, they had healthier babies. The birth weight reduction was bad. Probably inferred that, but just for the sake of clarity. Why I'm specifying this is because it does prove that it was a caused effect of racial resentment, not of some random thing as a result of living in the United States. It was the fact that white people were upset at Arabs, and it showed up in the biology itself. But that's crazy though, right? Because that's backwards, right? Aren't the conservatives saying that like biology is destiny and the biology determines everything about you? And they say the same thing when it comes to gender. Whereas this one, For the Love of Men by Liz Plank, has a lot of good examples of this. Biological determinism. I think she might call it biological realism or gender. There's lots of different ways to express the same concept. Sorry, getting distracted. Again, this book also, incidentally, has lots of examples of non-zero-sum thinking. Feminism is good for everyone. Like, you'll be less alone as a man if you stop embracing stoic masculine ideals that make you want to tough it out. Anyway, I've literally made other videos about that. Why am I bringing this up? Because it's backwards, right? It's backwards from what people say. The conservatives are saying biological factors are the real cause, and that makes gender. Biological factors are the real cause, and that makes race. But if you have examples of society affecting the biology, then all of a sudden, those causal loops, they influence each other. It is a circle. It is not an arrow. That is an important distinction. And this is fun, right? It's cool to learn new things about the structure of the world. The problem is that learning new things about the structure of the world and being interested in intellectual things, it's fun. There should be joy in activism, pleasure activism. It's a whole thing. The problem is that these have life and death consequences. There's nothing about being genetically closer to blackness that would make you die earlier. But you're statistically likely to live something like 7 years less. I can't remember the exact number. I put it in red somewhere. Telomeric data, page 34, written on... The page numbers might be different. This is an advanced release copy. Telomeres are the things in your biology that are like clocks for your age. Basically... Estimated that women between 49 and 50 years old, black women have a cellular age that is biologically 7.5 years older than white women's. You're more likely to die in a world that is creating the race of blackness. So we can finally complete our 3x5 card journey, which is biological determinism. Biological determinism is false. And we can start to weave all of these things together. If we built a world that worked for every person, right? We built a world that was not ableist and wasn't designed for certain people. It would literally help everyone. We see this in examples like the economy. If we had had better protections for Black Americans, 2008 as a crisis might not have happened. We would have more public pools. We would have access to more public resources. The world would be a better place for everyone if we had not created these eugenic concepts and decided who we thought was worthy of being alive and who we think is destined to die. There's a book that I have not cited very much because it's horrible. It's called Killing the Black Body by Dorothy Roberts. I don't put it up because, one, I cite Roberts a lot here, two, I haven't finished reading it, and three, TikTok and the internet doesn't, it's a horrible phrase to exist. But this is our history. This is the world that we have created, and it shows up not just in the data, it shows up in the weight of children and the telomeres and the length of lives. And I had said something about education, and I didn't bring it back, but the same logic applies. You can just copy and paste the logic and use it there. If we built an education system that was more robust, it would literally be better for everyone. McGhee goes into this and he's like, there would be less crime if education was better. There would be less crime if there was less poverty. What are conservative people complaining about with black people except for crime all the time? Crime is a riffraff, that urban is just a practically racial slur when you're using it in the wrong context. There would be less crime if we built a world where there was less poverty, and that would be better for everyone. There would be a stronger economy if we built a world that had a stronger education system, and that would be better for everyone, because we have tried to decide who we think deserves to be in charge. We have made it worse for ourselves. And wrap it up, connected to things. Part of why I'm excited for Kamala Harris to take the lead, because literally it's white nationalism has been on the rise. Project 2025, conclusion. Oh my God, there's so many things that I want to talk about. I need to make longer form videos. Thank you for watching. I'm Charlie. Join Patreon if you're still here. That's the best way to support. Like, share, subscribe, follow, buttons. Every like is a sticky. Soldier, your best man's gun. That's not right. Quote from Captain America. Every bond you buy is a bullet in your best man's. Right. Bye.